So, Trish and Wes, first of all, thank you all very much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this. Besides what anybody else is thinking and all the other people that are here, I'm personally really excited because this is kind of delving into a new kind of view or lens on community and education that was new to me before just a couple of weeks ago. So I'm really excited to learn from you all about this space. And I think a great place to start is just to kind of define what community-led education is and what sets it apart from traditional models of education. Wes, I was wondering if you could start us off by answering that.
Yeah, for sure. So I define community-led education as bidirectional. So if you look back on traditional education, whether it's K through 12 or college or learning on Skillshare or Udemy, it's usually a sage on stage model where there's an expert on stage and they monologue and everyone else has to sit quietly and listen. So that's very one directional, it's passive. Whereas community-based learning, community-led learning is bidirectional, meaning that sure, there might be an expert who's facilitating conversation or teaching, but students are teaching back to the instructor and they're also teaching each other. So it's a lot richer of an experience because instead of passively consuming content, you're actively thinking, you're discussing, you're debating, you're critiquing each other's work, you're role playing, and it's a lot more engaging, it's a lot more interactive, and it leads to better experiences and better student outcomes.
It sounds a lot, I mean, in a sense, it sounds like that really great college course that I took way back when I was in college. That wasn't like any of the other college courses where you actually got to like be engaged and work alongside a professor. So it doesn't feel new at all, but it is. How does it kind of bring up on that? How is it kind of bringing it into the 21st century? How has that been for kind of adapting this model?
Yeah, so if we go all the way back to Socrates teaching his students in the village square, that was cohort-based. So it was Socrates and a bunch of people in real time learning together. The difference is with cohort-based learning that this is all happening online and it's digitally native. It's online first. So if we look at the last 10 years of online learning, the dominant format has been MOOCs, massive open online courses. So those are the passive video-driven, self-paced courses that I was talking about. It's basically a series of videos that you watch solo by yourself. There's unlimited freedom to do the course whenever you want to. And theoretically, that means that you have a lot of motivation to learn and study on your own. But what that really means is usually, people watch 15 minutes of a lecture and then the course just gathers digital dust for the next 5 years. So completion rates are super low, between 7 to 10%. There's a recent MIT study that said 3 to 6%. So really low. A bunch of people sign up, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, eager, optimistic, and a tiny, tiny percentage of people actually finish. So with cohort-based learning, it's basically going back to the Socrates era, back to K through 12, that great college course that you had, borrowing the best parts of in-person education, pairing it with the scalability of the internet, and then creating something that is digitally native and yet still cohort-based.
So in cohort, I really appreciate you bringing up this idea of a cohort-based model, because that's something that's really central, I think, both to the work you're doing, Wes, and Trish, to the work you're doing as well. Trish, how are you using this cohort model for On Deck, and how is it different from a more traditional experience that the people you're working with might have?
Yeah, well, I think great introduction, Wes. Thanks for laying the foundation. I think so. Like, two things to add to kind of the general thinking around like community and cohort-based education is I think there's a million different ways to do it. Like, I think so. It's a really broad term, and I've seen a lot of different flavors within there. And I think the amount of innovation just in that space alone is part of what makes it. But I think there's kind of like two interesting things to bring up. And so one thing is like a lot of what I've seen at think of like community-based education is there's not necessarily a teacher in all situations. Like in some there is a subject matter expert, but a lot of times we're actually looking on like the community to be learning from each other. And I think one of the kind of core things that makes that possible is the cohort, it's not people you're learning with, it's people that you're like doing the same thing as them, right? So like when you look at like one of our fellowships, I'll use the example of the design fellowship. It's not that everyone is in there 101, it's that they're all designers trying to up level their career, right? So more than the idea, it's like we're learning together, but we're also doing together. And I think that's what makes it so exciting in many senses, is like you're actually just journeying alongside people on the same journey. Is like the community-based approach, because when you think about something like algebra, like a bunch of 6-year-olds trying to teach each other algebra is not going to be very interesting, because there's just an objective way to do algebra and the teacher is going to tell you how to do it, and that's probably one of the best ways that you can figure out algebra. But when you think about something like up-leveling my career as a designer and like, you know, getting like presentations of it in my organization to an executive, there's people who've done that more often. There's people that can share a lot of different perspectives. There's definitely subject matter experts in the area, but ultimately like sharing stories and perspectives with other people who are also doing that is like one of the best ways to learn. And so I think when I see like so much of the power of the community-based cohort and the way that we see a lot of it is actually like the curation of the community is one of the right. So that's how we've been focused a lot, is like, how can we get all these people on like an aligned stage so that truly just sharing their experiences is a way they can learn from each other. So focusing on that curation instead of so many of the other ways that you can focus on education, I think is the way that we've come to kind of like grow and build on the community-based model.
That's awesome. I think another interesting thing about the cohorts is something that I was thinking, it was just you're talking about this, is in some ways what you're describing sounds a lot like a community of practice. Right? There's a lot of research and stuff that goes into that particular model. On the other hand, it's a little different, because with a cohort, it's smaller often, and often, at least in y'all's work, often it's time bound as well. It's not a permanent community. And I'm wondering why you choose to move forward with a model that has these small, often time bound cohorts, as opposed to a big group or a permanent group that's kind of together for the long haul. Trish, you want to keep going?
Yeah, I can kick us off. So I think one of the things that's really exciting about the cohort style and like anything that's time bound in general is it drives urgency. So if you know that you could do something forever, you're less likely to actually engage and do that. So I think like that urgency is what creates a lot of the energy around things. And it's also the, you know, like I think how exciting it is to like jump into something new when 30 other people or 50 other people are starting it at the same time, versus like you just couldn't sleep one night and decide to do something new yourself. Like obviously one of those is more likely to kind of like carry forwards in a pretty strong way. So I think having things that are time urgency creates the energy, creates the social cohesion, and then it's all kind of a beautiful snowball from there. And I can probably speak on this a little bit more later, but we're actually starting to think about different ways to create like that urgency, but also more long-term and more permanence. So I think actually like this question it can go in a lot of directions, because I don't necessarily think it's like just the like time-bound cohort. I think there's probably interesting ways that it can be like a yes and to some of the other differences that you mentioned as well.
Awesome. Wes, how do you see kind of the cohorts as opposed to these other kind of ways to bring people together? What do you see the value in it for the work you're doing?
Yeah, so going back to what you said earlier about the time-bound piece, Trish, I loved what you said about the urgency and focus that a time-bound program or event can really bring. Story from altMBA. So before starting Maven, I co-founded the altMBA with Seth Godin and grew it to thousands of alumni from 45 countries, 500 cities. And every single time we ran the altMBA, which is a 1-month program, at the end, we would get students who would beg us to leave Slack open. So they had just finished this amazing sprint and they were on this energy high, and they would say, please don't close down Slack. This is going to be amazing. We want to keep in touch. We want to keep shipping work together. And usually we said, no, like we're going to close it down and set expectations. But one time we decided to keep it open, to just see how it goes, right? Like, let's experiment with this. So we left it open, and a week later, it was just completely dead. And so I think like there's a lesson here, which is a lot of times we think that when a party is happening and it's awesome, it's popping. I don't know if popping is still what Gen Z uses, but when it's popping, you want to keep it going. But there's a point where the party's kind of reached its peak and it's kind of going downhill. And And you just trying to keep it going doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to keep the energy going. And so what we did was at the end of that 1 month, we would close the Slack for the students, but then we would move them into an ongoing community, into an ongoing Slack with a different set of expectations, a different set of events, a different set of guardrails. And with that, it was basically the alumni community. We told students not to expect the same 30-day sprint of shipping with each other that they had in the altMBA, that the pace was going to be different. And that was fine because this was a 1 month thing that you signed up for where you were kind of really rigorously focused and kind of ignoring everything else in your life to really do this intense program. But that's not sustainable for the rest of the year. And you wouldn't necessarily want something that intense. So we created something that made more sense as an ongoing community to be involved in. So I think setting expectations with, throwing the confetti when something ends and celebrating something for what it is, and then setting new expectations for, hey, this is ongoing. This is a different thing. Don't try to recreate that. Like, this is going to be different. It's new. It's separate. Here's what to expect going forward, and here's why it's beneficial for you as an ongoing community.
That's great. And also answering, we got the question in the Q&A on that you just answered right there from Ben about how do you feed people into larger communities. So you read his mind. Thank you. Trish, a lot of online education ends up being sort of like the antithesis of community-led. It's something that Wes was kind of getting at earlier, talking about MOOCs. And while it can feel isolating and it's hard for learners to engage with and all sorts of the issues that lead to the really low completion rates, it's also, in a sense, it democratizes education. It's one of the things we hear a lot about the value of this, and that it's cheaper. Sometimes it's free. It's easier to access for people who are on non-traditional schedules. How can online community-led education improve the learning experience for people so that we don't have the really awful completion rates and outcomes that we're seeing, but still be able to kind of meet the needs of people for whom scheduling and/or money and time are barriers?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm actually a fan of having a huge range of different options, because I myself, and I've seen other people learn in many different ways, and a lot of it depends on what you're learning or what you're doing. And so I actually think there's a time and a place for a huge array of different options, and community-based is probably not the best for every single situation, exactly for those reasons. But I do think there's some ways to make the community style of things more accessible as well. So a few kind of things we've been experimenting with is, I think, a mix of thoughtful async and synchronous sessions can be a huge value add. So obviously the global time zone that hits all around the world is very small, if not even existent. So I find if you want to get 30 minutes, an hour in that time zone, it needs to be incredibly valuable. And so a lot of times there's async, work or framing or thinking or something that can lead up to make that actual synchronous time much more valuable, which creates just a lot more flexibility around schedules. So I think there's just a lot to be said around different formats, different ways of doing things. We've experimented with async AMAs instead of doing them live. And yeah, there's all sorts of kind of different ways to just make things more globally or scheduling friendly. The other thing that I think is a huge tool, though, is especially for when you're thinking of a community-based education where the connections in the community are one of the core value adds, and you have less of the instructor-led model. I think in that case, oftentimes the most time-consuming thing is combing through the community and finding the most relevant people for you to meet, right? So if you onboard in a cohort of 100, it's 100 people you need to read about them to decide who's really relevant to what you're doing. So a lot of times I think of this concept of just how can we reduce the amount of time that people need to put in to get value out of things? Of course you need to put in some amount of time, but how can we as smooth as possible? And so one thing we've been experimenting with for the last few months at On Deck that's been super exciting is we actually have a few matchmakers. So people who are full-time matching different people and saying, hey, you two should meet because you're both doing this in this way kind of thing. So just giving that kind of very direct path to value of here's the community, here's a super relevant person for you to meet. And that 30-minute conversation then becomes something that, people will do whatever it takes to schedule that because they know it's going going to be an incredibly unique person that they probably should have met years ago. So yeah, all of that to say, I won't keep bantering on this, but I think there's a lot of different ways that we can actually make like scheduling, timing, all of that more accessible, even in a community-based model.
Great. I like the idea of a matchmaker. That's like, I think I see that a lot in communities. I've actually benefited from that myself, where I've come into a new space and somebody's like, you should meet this person. And I think like actually having somebody who focuses on that could be a really valuable thing for folks. Wes, I don't want to take a step back from thinking about like structure, organization, stuff like that, and just kind of ask if you can kind of reflect on your own growth as an educator. How have communities influenced you and helped you to grow personally?
Right now I'm teaching a pretty meta course. It's a cohort-based course on how to build a cohort-based course. So my students are creators and experts, subject matter experts, operators, consultants, coaches, authors who basically want to teach what they know and add another revenue stream. So a lot of what I teach in the course is based on what I've learned from iterating on our own program over the last couple of months. So we have a program coming up at the end of September, and that's going to be the 4th time that we're running this cohort. And every single time that I've run it, I've changed a bunch of things and made it a ton better. And a lot of that has been based on feedback from the community, feedback from the actual instructors, feedback from community members that we've shared our content with. And I think a lot about not being delusional. So I might have an idea about what I think works and what people are going to love. But if there are signs that people don't love it or it's not working, I kill it quickly and do more of what is working. So I think communities are amazing for crowdsourcing and surfacing insights around what is actually valuable for people. And if you pay attention and you listen, you get a lot of great information. So for us, for example, originally the course was a one week program, 5 days, super intense sprint. The next time I ran it, it was 6 weeks. The next time, 6 weeks again. And then this upcoming cohort, we're doing 3 weeks. So length is just one of the things that we changed based on feedback from participants saying, this is a lot, it's super intense. But, at first when you hear feedback, it's really natural to get a little bit defensive. Like, oh, well, I designed it that way on purpose or something. But, getting past that as quickly as possible and then thinking like, okay, where's there validity in what people are saying? What can I take away? That's led to the biggest improvements with tightening our curriculum, tightening our approach, tightening our pedagogy.
Cool. So Trish, one of the things I always like to think about these is that mistakes are a critical part of learning. And I always like to hear what kind of mistakes have you made in doing this work? What's a mistake that you've had that you're willing to share that is actually in the end kind of helped you kind of build the process of kind of building OnDeck's education model?
This is a great question. I don't think we left enough time in the panel for me to cover my reason. No, I'm kidding. Well, not really. I've plenty to choose from to share here. But actually, one that comes to mind, kind of similar to a few of the things we've discussed so far, is I think one of our early mistakes was getting maybe a bit attached to the model that we started with. And I think it's like it needs a lot of what Wes was saying around kind of like learning from customer feedback and like taking an honest look at that, because our first fellowships were 10-week cohorts for founders coming in. And a lot of these people who were coming in were between figuring out what's next. Like, should I start this company? I've kind of been toying with ideas here. How do I validate this? And they had a ton of time. They had usually more flexible working. They were spending 15, 20 hours a week engaging with the program. And we got amazing feedback on it. And we were like, 10 weeks, magic number, boom, let's do it. And we started to launch more and more different types of fellowships for, designers, project managers, people in ed tech all over the spectrum. And over time, we started to kind of like hear different types of feedback from customers. And I started to see different trends emerge and kind of starting to putting together a bunch of the dots. It was like, we actually have a very different customer in some of these fellowships, right? So the way that you engage with an on-deck fellowship when you have 15 to 20 hours a week versus a full-time job and 2 to 3 hours a week starts to look highly different, and the way that curate the experience needs to also look very different. And at the same time, we also, so anytime somebody starts an on-deck fellowship, we ask, like, what does success look like for you at the end of this fellowship? And people are coming into 8 or 10 week fellowships, but saying things that would take you 8 to 10 months to actually do. And so we started to kind of like talk to people more, understand more, and people were like, yeah, I don't exactly think I'm going to do that in the fellowship, but that's actually what I'm trying to do. So like, that's what I said, kind of thing. And so we started to see, like, okay, maybe this is like, maybe people are coming steps that you're not going to take in 10 weeks. And so now we've started to kind of look at different models where you're still onboarded in a cohort to have like a lot of that kind of like intimate bonding, energy, and urgency at the beginning. But then you actually come into an annual membership where there's different inflection points and support along the way, which is much more helpful when you're, going through your project manager, when you're going through your career as a product manager. It's much more helpful to have, a few hours where you engage with a mastermind group every other week, and you're coming in for content a couple of times a quarter, actually kind of matching like that journey. So all of, I think, like our kind of initial mistake was like thinking that the same model will work because it worked the first time, when in reality it's like that model worked because of what like the success was that people were looking to get out of that, and how much time they had to engage, and who the customers were. And so really thinking about like, what are we solving for, and who's the customer, and what journey are they on, and how can we match that, instead of like, we really love this model. So that's something that we're kind of like, just constantly evolving and learning from people of like, hey, how's this going?
Cool. We've got just a couple of minutes left, so I want to make sure to get to some of the questions that have been coming into the question box. I want to start with one from Pixie Cigar, who asks, how are you measuring the success of, I think this is for Wes particularly, how are you measuring the success of your alumni groups in regards to community, operational, KPI, and business KPI?
Yeah, I think a lot of measurement with alumni communities is both qualitative and quantitative. So quantitatively, looking at the number of messages sent in the Slack room, for example, to see how much chatter is there happening usually. Qualitatively, I think how useful people find that alumni community. So are people coming back to ask questions that they have top of mind that they're working on, and are other community members able to jump in and help? So for example, with altMBA, a lot of community members will ask about questions that they're currently dealing with at work. So a challenge that they're having with their boss, or a project that they want to launch, and a roadblock that they're getting stuck on. Or they might ask about something really specific, like, does anyone have experience with marketing on Kickstarter, crowdfunding type marketing? And other community members will jump in and help out. So seeing that kind of support and that culture of generosity is super important, really huge. We're seeing that now with Pomp and his course, Anthony Pompliano. He has a crypto course, and it's a 2 to 3 week course. He has a job board with it. He has a community afterwards that everyone joins. And it's a place where people who are obsessed with crypto and Bitcoin can nerd out together and share memes, talk about the investments that they're making, discuss what they're working on. So I think it's both qualitative and quantitative. I think especially in the early days for first-time course creators, not getting too bogged down with running A/B tests or really looking at super hard metrics is okay, because your numbers are still really small. So it's hard to do a great A/B test anyway if your numbers are pretty small. But looking for the energy level and commitment and how excited people are people's eyes lighting up when they talk about your program? When they talk about a friend, are they getting excited? When they tell a friend, are they getting excited to recommend this community, to recommend this program? So I think looking at those eyes light up moments can help you see what is that excitement level really.
Cool. Jamie, are you here to give us the hook?
We're getting close.
Okay.
Maybe we can do one more quick one.
One more question? Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. So we got one more question from Sydney, who asks, what are examples of ways you bring cohorts together in the beginning to encourage them to connect and learn from each other without facilitation later?
I can throw in a quick idea here. So I think there's a bunch of different ways, but one way that we've seen, I think, some decent successes is just to set up the structure to actually do that. So a quick kind of step-by-step of how we launch mastermind groups at the beginning of a cohort is we do a session and kind of some early training on just like how to facilitate mastermind groups, how they run, and then we actually just like set up the schedule for mastermind groups. So it's because it's fairly inorganic in my experience for a small group of people to meet over and over again and set that up from the very beginning. Because it really takes somebody who's like extremely organized to be like, okay, us 5 are working on similar things. I'm going to make a Zoom link. We're going to come every other Tuesday at this time. I'm going to take notes. I know how to run the sessions. Like there's just a lot of infrastructure that I think you can pretty easily put into place that kind of sets that up for people, because it's not always natural to do that in the early days. So I think that's one great example of like, and really like anything that creates, I find to be just like very compelling. So that's what I love around things of like, if you just know that you're going to do this on a bi-weekly basis for X amount of time, and that's what makes it valuable is the continued connection, then that's just like an amazing way to kind of like encourage that ongoing thing from day one without it really being forced. So giving people the tools and the structures and then letting it flow usually works pretty well.
It's awesome. Thank you. And thank you both. Thanks, Trish. Thanks, Wes, for coming and talking with us today. This has been awesome. So I really appreciate it. Jamie, I can see that you want us to go away. So everybody, thank you very much for attending.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Enjoy the
everyone.
next session. All right.